Bitcoin is close to becoming worthless.
Let's go. Now, what's the Bitcoin?
Bitcoin's like rat poison.
Yeah. Oh,
The greatest scam in history.
let's get it.
Bitcoin will go to fucking zero.
Yeah.
Alright, you ungovernable misfits. I'm your host, Max. Everybody knows that Bitcoin is useless, worthless, and doomed to fail. But what if everyone's wrong? What if it's the system that is doomed to fail? Join me as I speak to some of the brightest people in the space and slither to the deepest, darkest depths of the Bitcoin rabbit hole.
Welcome back to Pleb Miner Month. Today's episode is with Moses and John. This is out a little bit later than I had planned. I had done all the editing, intros, outros and everything else, and then my computer crapped out on me. So yeah, just finished doing it again, but it was nice to listen back. It is an awesome podcast. Really enjoyed listening to these guys and some food for thought. This Azola stuff that they get into is very interesting and I'd love to see where it goes. Before we jump into the show, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been participating in Pleb Miner Month. It's been incredible to see how many people have reached out, given content, jumped on pods, and supported in many other ways. If you've been using the Podcasting 2.0 apps like Fountain or Breeze to stream us sats, I want to say a massive thank you. Every single one of those sats will be going towards postage for the incredible prizes that our sponsors have given. I also want to thank everyone who's been participating in sharing and sending this out to friends and family and helping people get into Bitcoin the right way. I also want to thank Foundation Devices for not only sponsoring this month by giving 2 Foundation Devices passports away, but also for supporting this show every month and allowing it to continue. I really do appreciate their open source ethos, beautiful design and incredible team. In a couple of days I will be releasing a pod with Bitcoin Q&A and Lily, so listen out for that one. And also watch out for the prize draw for these passports. If you haven't already checked them out, go to foundationdevices.com, use the code BITBYBIT for $10 off, and if you have any questions at all, you can reach out and ask me. I'd also like to thank Fast Bitcoins for sponsoring this show. Despite me constantly bashing KYC services, they still support me. This shows me that they care about Bitcoin and they care about the direction that this goes. And although I do bash on KYC services, and I suggest you go and you mine or you buy KYC free, I know that not all of you are going to do that. If you're not going to do that, then I can only suggest that you go to a team that really cares about this movement, that really does everything that they can to keep you safe and doesn't just give up your data for no reason. I have a huge amount of respect for this team, and if you want to ask me any questions about the trade-offs, I will be open and honest. You can also reach out to Fast Bitcoin's team and they can answer any questions you might have. Go to fastbitcoins.com and enjoy the show.
Moses, can you hear me all right still?
Yes, sir.
All right, sweet. So thanks for joining us on Pleb Miner Month to talk about all the things that you know, farming, regenerative agriculture, Azola, and what can be done with that. So do you want to start out just like kind of telling everybody, you know, who you are and what your background is and the things that you're interested in?
Yeah, thanks, dude. I'm just a pleb. I no particular background in anything. I've been a carnivore longer than I've been into Bitcoin. Been down that whole path of regenerative agriculture and health being not an external thing, being an internal thing, and something that, you know, it really ties back down to our food and food quality mostly. And the toxic sludge that passes as food these days is generally where you can trace most illness back to. Mm-hmm. And so I was really sick maybe 10 years ago, close to 10 years ago. And then I would, for, 3 to 4 years, I remember just kind of trying this, trying that, seeing this specialist, seeing that specialist, never getting resolution, just being told I needed surgeries and medications and all this other stuff. And it just seemed like a slippery slope towards further and further reliance on the medical system. And it was just terrible. I'd been in a bad car accident, and what had happened was I had a lot of structural damage to like my fascia mostly, and different issues. So it was restricting like my organs in certain areas. And like, I was just had a lot of mobility issues. And so then I went down the whole, functional fitness rabbit hole. And then I remember seeing Dr. Sean Baker on Joe Rogan. I think it was 2016. And that was the breaking moment for me. I listened to him talk and I was like, well, that's simple enough. And I just started doing it at that point. And then I found, Dr. Paul Saladino and all of his stuff, the carnivore, I think carnivore code or whatever he has. But he talks about the nose to tail and everything. And I just started eating the most nutritious, dense food I could possibly find and avoiding all the sludge and getting sunlight, sunning my balls, that whole thing. Like I went full into the whole, get barefoot as much as possible and just try to live as ancestrally aligned as we possibly can. And I feel better now than I did in my teens, and I'm in my 30s. So it's wild how, 6 years or so of just trying to, not pollute my body with industrial byproduct, has went from being a very sick individual to having better vitality than I felt like I did in my teens. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's my background. And then I discovered Bitcoin through the whole, during 2020. I'd actually known about Bitcoin for a long time. My roommate mined it on his laptop, 2011. So I had opportunity to get in very, very early. I didn't even pay attention enough to care. And at one point, I remember my roommate gifted me some Bitcoin back then, and I like totally lost track of it, never even cared enough to even bother preserving it at all, because it just meant nothing to me back then. And 2017, I remember when everything was like, the bull market hype and all the normies were sort of hearing about Bitcoin. I remember hearing about it again at that point and being like, wait a second. In 2011, I had some of these things. I remember doing the math on it, being like, I'd be multi-millionaire now. This is so dumb. Why didn't I keep that shit?
Everyone's got this sense of regret from that.
Yeah, man. Well, especially because I had them too, right? And it wasn't even like they found me and then I didn't care. And I was like, no, that kind of bit me. And then I remember being bitter about Bitcoin for a few years. Just kind of like, screw Bitcoin. And I remember watching it crash back down to, whatever it crashed down to in March 2020 and feeling kind of like good. Like, yeah, I'm glad I didn't buy that in 2017. like, yeah, screw Bitcoin. I kind of felt like that about it because it was, I just felt bitter inside that I'd missed out, so to speak. And then watching it crash, I was like, yeah, that shit's dead. And then, yeah, exactly. But then when coronavirus hit and the New World Order was announced, I remember I'm Canadian. I remember seeing Justin Trudeau get on his porch and say, if you're abroad, now is the time to come home. And like this weird speech. And I remember going like, this is the New World Order. They just announced the New World Order. Like that, it was cognitive to me in that moment.
The Pied Piper calling the weak Canadians home.
Yeah. I was like, well, it's a wrap, boys. I remember just thinking like that. And I was sitting at a job site with some guys, and the one guy, I remember he put his hands up in the air with 3 fingers, and he said, "And may the odds ever be in your favor," because we were all kind of like gathered around watching this YouTube video. And I was like, dude, that's definitely the vibe. Like, that's so weird, It was very like dystopian-esque, and I could feel the dystopianness in the presentation of it all. And it sort of sent me into like a reanalyzation mode of everything, and then that's kind of where I ended up finding YouTube videos about Bitcoin and watching things like there's a guy called Trader University. He's one of the first guys I found that started to open my eyes up about the first principles behind what it is. And then, of course, I went down the shitcoining rabbit hole. I got kind of wrapped up into all the, Pomp videos and the Ivan guy and all these other like mainstream normie sort of pulls. Learned a few sort of, basic things. I remember I bought some VeChain and random shit coins and stuff. And then I still knew then, though, that Bitcoin was the main thing to get. And I was trying to get it as much of it as I could back then, because I already kind of knew that was something that was the most valuable. But I didn't have like a maximalist perspective, or I hadn't really done the research yet. And then I spent all of 2020, basically, I got on Twitter and I just started like absorbing all the podcasts, reading all the books, and just like, I did the full, I'd say I probably did my 5,000 to 10,000 hours, somewhere in there. I didn't keep track, but I've done a lot of learning about Bitcoin since then. And I feel like I'm only scratching the surface. So that's kind of where I got to this point was just, I was originally a health guy. And then I sort of, through the dystopianness of the last 2 years, I sort of found what Bitcoin is, the beacon of truth and the beacon of hope in all the chaos. Right. And then, I think Twitter has been the most influential in my sort of perspective, developing my perspective in the last year or so, since sort of being more active on Twitter and engaging with everyone that has these perspectives. And that's why I find it such an interesting culture online. The Bitcoin culture is I like calling it the Bitcoin culture, not the Bitcoin community, because it just sounds
I kind of like that term a little bit better too.
Right?
Community does sound lame.
It does sound lame, sounds so orchestrated, but it's not that. It's truly culture. And I find what's interesting about it is it's a truth-seeking culture. It doesn't matter where you're at. It's very like on the nose, whatever the subject is. Let's hit it on the nose. Let's get to the truth of the matter. Let's break this down to first principles and let's come to a solution. It's a very solution-based mindset, being somebody who sees the world through the scope. I feel like being on Bitcoin Twitter has given me hope for the rest of humanity. Because if you're just in your pocket alone in the world, amongst your peers, you have certain people that, maybe see your perspective, maybe don't. But for the most part, it feels like all the normies are just sheep, right? And then you get online and you're like, wow, there's actually hundreds of thousands of people that are awake, and they can see things for what they are, and they're looking for solutions. And yeah, man, I'm excited to be early enough in all of this to hopefully be a part of those solutions, because I think this culture that we're sort of witnessing firsthand here is going to be talked about, in 100 years, 200 years. They're going to look back and they're going to talk about this moment in history as like, hey, this was this wild time where the plebs, like this subculture of people, took power back from the elites. And they just made better systems that did things better, and they basically just outperformed them. And it's like, when they look back, I believe, in hundreds of years, they'll write history books about this time. They'll be like, hey, instead of the 1776, they wrote the Constitution. They'll be talking about, the Bitcoin Audible series and what it did for the world. You know what I mean? Like that's where I think it's going to go.
The new Federalist Papers, Bitcoin Audible.
Exactly, dude.
I always find everybody's story kind of interesting, and like the stages of grief, and somebody dies, and first I don't know the stages of grief off the top of my head, but it's like you're sad, and then you have the denial phase, and then you have the acceptance phase, and then you kind of come out of it in that way. And a lot of people go through this same journey with Bitcoin. It's like, well, didn't really know about it in 2009, 2010, 2011, 12, kind of discovered it. I had a friend, I was doing a little bit of messing around, mining, something like that, forgot about it. 2017 hits, holy shit. And now everybody's talking about, do I have those keys? Did I have any Bitcoin at all? Get a little bit angry, and then you're kind of in the denial stage, like, oh shit, I missed out. And that's why everybody apes into shit coins and say, well, I missed out on Bitcoin, but maybe I can get rich quick on all this other bullshit. And then usually the pattern is somebody gets rug pulled and wrecked on the shit coins, and they come back home to where they started.
Yeah, I never got rug pulled, thankfully.
I didn't either, and I kind of say that to people too. I didn't get rug pulled, and they're like, oh. You're like mad at me, like, I'm sorry, I didn't get rug pulled on shit coins, but I did come to Bitcoin in that way to say, like, why am I selling all this Bitcoin that actually means something for the shit coin? What's the catch here? Why do they want me to exchange my Bitcoin? And it's not until later that you figure out, well, that's kind of the design of 99.999% of these shit coins is to separate you from your Bitcoin. Yep. It's also interesting that
that's what they want.
A lot of these paths to Bitcoin are all kind of this spider web thing, whether it's regenerative agriculture, whether it's ancestral eating, whether it's a question for the powers that be, a question for religion, a question for government and our society and entertainment. And once you start questioning everything that you've been told, somehow we all keep coming back to this nexus of Bitcoin. My favorite thing about Bitcoin, the Bitcoin culture and pleb subculture, is you can talk to just about any pleb and say, hey, I'm really interested in permaculture. I'm really interested in regenerative agriculture. I'm also interested in alternative sources of power. And in all likelihood, they're going to tell you, yeah, I'm interested in that too. I've really been researching this and that. And I think a lot of people eventually are going to stumble upon you and what you're doing with Azola and what your visions are for regenerative agriculture and the permaculture community. So I guess let's just dive right into it. Let's start talking about Living Power Gen.
Thanks, bro. I see Bitcoin personally as a crop. I like the idea and the concept of viewing Bitcoin as a crop because it's a phenomenon of nature, right? Like the way we talk about Bitcoin as a discovery, not an invention, right? Like we compare it to fire. Fire is something that's always existed in nature long before humans ever learned how to harness fire. It existed as a phenomenon, but we as humans discovered the ability to use it as a tool, right? Sort of encapsulate it, and now we have control over this fire. And I see Bitcoin as the same thing. Cryptography is inherent to the nature of the universe. It's always been there. It exists. It's just we discovered how to sort of combine it with energy in this discovery that is Bitcoin, and it solves the Byzantine generals problem. And the ability for it to solve the Byzantine general problem is the most fascinating part because it allows you to scale the consensus of a tribe. So if you see a tribal society, they have no governance. They have consensus without governance because as the size is, the sort of the people govern themselves. The chief holds the most respect, not the most power. It's not the position holds no power, right? It's the person that holds the respect, and that's sort of consensus, right? There's no individual or body that exerts exerts influence over the body. They're autonomous in all of their governance. So you could say it's consensus, not governance. As soon as you scale past that, there arises a need for governance, and it always will happen. You'll form some form of hierarchy once you move past the scale of like 150 to 200 humans. You're going to have some form of arbitrary body that has power over the rest. Whatever form you call that, it's still governance. And so I think what Bitcoin does is for the first time, we have the ability to have that tribal consensus at scale. And outside of money, just the ability for us to agree on something without a third party to agree, to mediate the agreement. And that's why we can build perfect money out of it. And so that's the most wildest thing ever. You can now truly imagine a society in the future that's post-governance consensus, which is astounding. Because if you look at a tribe, they don't have crime, they don't have poverty, they don't have any of the things that afflict our society today. They don't afflict a tribal society at all. They don't have chronic disease. They have none of these things. And so you could say they almost are more wealthy than us from a raw human perspective. And I believe we can experience that at mass in modern humanity because of Bitcoin now. That's really the true revolutionary power of it, as this sort of consensus thing that we can build around it.
Isn't it interesting, though, that as complicated as Bitcoin is, as complicated as SHA-256 algorithm it is, and mining, and when you explain these concepts to people, it's totally out of sight for them. But all that we're trying to do is actually go back in time to a time where principles mattered, to where our relationship with our families and our associates and the people that we work together, that was the dominant thing, that our relationship to the land and our environment and our food, that was the thing that we cared about the most. And all throughout human history, all we have done was to further complicate it. So isn't it interesting that this very complicated thing comes into our life and it's bringing us back to our roots, back to our ancestral heritage?
Yeah, well, it rediscovers value because we lost value, right? So forever human value, like in a tribe, right? Where's value lie in a tribe? Well, it relies on resources generally, right? And also your ability to have peace and with your fellow tribe members. That's sort of where value lies, the ability to protect your tribe, the ability to, hunt and gather all these things. And as we build these hierarchies, the value starts to accumulate with the hierarchy, so that the value incentive now for the individual is to simply achieve higher hierarchy. It's not to actually contribute more value. It's just to achieve higher rank, essentially, right? And so that process distorts value so that there's now issuers of value. And this goes all the way to the extreme end being central banks, where they just literally make it up from thin air. But even before that, with gold and stuff, it still led to centralization of value, where you could have issuers of value. With Bitcoin, that changes everything, because now you can have the value just like a resource in nature, the same way that it would be in a tribal society. And this is why I see Bitcoin being a crop as the most sort of useful way to look at that, because then you're actually just harvesting your Bitcoin. You can grow your own Bitcoin. And that becomes a sort of a way to produce value inherently, just like you would inherently produce value by acquiring resources like food and water and things like that. I have a prediction by 2028, 2 halvings from now, I think biomass mining will be the standard in the way that natural gas flaring is the standard today, because it will be the most widely available, cheapest form of energy. And that puts farmers at the closest source to the value in this society, which they should be, and they always traditionally have been. You've always had your farmers, or if you're a hunter-gatherer tribal society, it's the hunters and the gatherers, that the ones that procure your calories for your society, they hold the most value. And so your farmer was the source of value in the society centered around it, was built around the ability to procure resources. And now it's built around the ability to get close to the money printer, right? So if we can build it so that farmers are the source of nutrients, the source of energy, and the source of liquidity or currency, now you have a society built around the proper source of value on all fronts. And right now it's not that way, because I'm not one of those people who says oil and gas is inherently evil, but I'm also not one of these people that are sort of naive and in denial about the ecological damage from the oil and gas industry.
Sure, oil and gas has to travel a long journey in order to be
exactly
to
and not
deliver
just
to the
that,
consumer.
It's the chemical off run from industrial farming, from industrial manufacturing processes, from the transporting, like you said, like pipelines and tankers and train cars, and there is ecological damage, and it usually occurs in most damages the water. I'm First Nations, and I represent the land back movement. That's a movement that I'm very much aligned with, and it basically has to do with the land being returned to Indigenous governments, and that doesn't necessarily mean a racial thing. It just means that the land is managed according to our traditional ways of managing it, which was what the reason why Turtle Island, North America, is why it was so fertile, was because this wasn't just rogue forest. It was permaculture. The whole place was permaculture, from the buffalo herd to the deer to the corn to the grass to like everything was in a state of permaculture, right? So we were basically managing the land in a very live, active role in the management of the land. And I believe in a return of those ways. I say that the rancher of the future is actually a hunter, right? That's what it used to be. That's what it should be. The animals should do their own thing, and then they should be harvested in sort of tune with the environment around it. I believe that we will eventually get there along this path that Bitcoin takes us by putting the value back in the farmer's hands. Because there, you can imagine if biomass farming is the incentive, growing biomass is the incentive, well, grass grows plentifully. It actually makes a great source of biofuel, specifically if you have massive swaths of grassland with growing very tall grass. You're maximizing the amount of BTUs you're going to get per acre. And the only way to do that is to have no fences and to have massive herds of megafauna roaming, right? So the incentive to actually grow the grasslands back again, I believe, will actually be Bitcoin mining, because it's going to be going to all these ranchers and landowners and be like, so like you have it fenced off and you're growing soybeans, right? Okay, well, that costs you a lot of money. What if you just rip the fences down? We run buffalo through here. The grass grows, you harvest the grass and you're mining Bitcoin with it. That's way more valuable. Right. So that becomes, again, always incentive is what drives the culture forward. That's why we're in the situation we're in, is because the incentive is get close to the money printer. Right. So biofarming as a concept, I believe, helps get us closer to a properly restructured society where the source of value is coming from the proper place. And then you have real merit within your society. It's not distorted.
A couple things that I want to cover with you is, let's go back to the Indigenous peoples of Canada and Turtle Island. The things that you want to do here, and we'll kind of get into the science part of it. how much protection do you have from the Canadian government given the native designation? Does that afford you guys a little bit more flexibility?
Not really, man. No, they've done nothing but oppress us, and they actually use their power to make us reliant. So take the water up north. So we have reserves up north, right? So there's a lot of remote reserves above the Arctic Circle or close to the Arctic Circle that don't have clean drinking water. And the government for like a long time now, decades, has been going on about fixing the clean drinking water. Every prime minister promises to fix the clean drinking water. It's always a hot topic. It's always a political junction point. It's always a pandering point forever. And there's so much money to be made off the problem that it's now more valuable than the solution. There's money and influence to be made off of it. Mm-hmm. Always the promise to fix, never actually fix.
Always a grift.
Yes. And so that leads to inherent governmental problems where they'll build a plant and then it'll fail or this, or it's just a lot of wasted money and resources and time. They're looking at it like, well, we have 500 people living in a town in the tundra. We're going to build a $3.5 million water filtration plant. Okay, let's do that. Oh, now we don't have the resources to keep it running, so we're going to shut it down. And then they're going to live next to the plant, but still have no clean drinking water. Like that's the kind of mentality that they do things with, right? Because and then it puts the people at a position of, well, now they're literally just reliant on the government for basic necessities. So then everyone just like does crack and sniffs gas, and you have problems. You have social problems. Alcohol is prohibited. There's literally prohibition up there where you can't get alcohol. It's like the most valuable thing to do up there is to sell alcohol. That's like the best job you could do is be an alcohol dealer. Jeez. Because like they build these black markets, and then the black markets again become the incentives, and then the incentives are what drive the culture. Fixing things like the water crisis is technically fairly easily. You don't need to build a giant industrial plant. You need to be able to, you could utilize Bitcoin mining, the solar growth, you could, anything like that. You just have to have some sort of viable life cycle that's producing profit, right? So that when you have that profit margin, you have that incentive model, that becomes what the incentive is. So if cleaning water is monetized, if the process of cleaning water is monetized, well, you're going to get a hell of a lot of clean water, right? Because like human greed is the most reliable motivator.
Yeah.
This is why it's like, no, the government, it doesn't give us anything. They'll give us no protection other than more problems, because any protection that they claim to give us is really just a grift that leads to more centralization of power, right? Like, you know, when they rolled out the jabs, they made sure that those reserves got vaccines, but they can't get clean drinking water for 20 years, right? So it's all about incentives, and the incentives are lined up for corruption within the native governance councils and stuff, which are essentially colonial institutions. They're not really how we govern ourselves. The way we should be governing ourselves and have governed ourselves is like according to the clan mothers, and there's old wisdom stored with the grandmothers, and the grandmothers sort of determine things and have a say, and there's a council and there's a fire and there's processes, and they've distorted all that, put it into like vote for your band member. And it's a very colonial concept that's instilled, but it allows that hierarchy to emerge. And so once you have that hierarchy, you have the incentive, and of course corruption leads to absolute corruption, absolutely, right? And power leads to absolute corruption, absolutely. And this is just where we're at. So as a land backer, I'm one of these people that believes in the deinstitutionalization of Native people. I believe that all people are indigenous. It's the colonial concept of governance, right? Being a land backer is basically being like a neo-anarchist in a way, because it's without rulers, but it's with rules.
I think that's an easier sell also than to not make it a racial component, but to make it a human component. You want self-governance, don't you? Well, what better way to have self-governance than your own tribe?
Or using old knowledge, using knowledge that's proven to work, has a proven track record, you know, and it's been abolished and erased for a reason. There's a reason the colonialists wanted to erase our cultures, because it's a powerful culture, and it shows how peace and prosperity can really work. We had a sort of hormesis effect on the land that we occupied, where we lived in harmony with it and in balance with it, and so did other tribes amongst themselves. Like, we never had full-on warfare the way that the feudalists did in Europe, right? We never gathered armies together and moved them against each other and slaughtered millions of people in a field. We've never, ever done that. It's always been like, you know, kidnap your enemy if you hate them, make them a slave, and then maybe if they're a good enough person, they'll be a chief one day in your tribe. That's more like how we performed warfare.
Or at least in the warfare I know, as far as the Comanches goes, they would choose who could be useful in their civilization. You know, if you were a baby, if you're an old person, it's likely they could have killed you in that time. But if you were a young person or you were a productive person, they would take you into their tribe.
Because there was no incentive to conquer everything and dominate it the way that the Romans did or whatever. There was not that hierarchy, that state that had emerged, right? Like if you look at the tribes of Europe, they were the same as the tribes of Turtle Island until the Romans got there. They lived the same ways. So it's not a race thing at all. It's all about the state. And does the state emerge and does the state gain power? And once the state gains power, it never ever stops. And now we have Bitcoin, this thing that can reverse engineer the state and immobilize it. You know, and I think that's like, people say, oh, why are Bitcoiners so anti-government stuff? Like, well, because the whole concept is to separate money from state. And once you separate money from state, well, the state has no more power. So, I mean, it's not our fault that their power lies in the money. It's not like we're inherently anti-state, but the state would have to compete in a free market, which it can't by nature because it's a parasitic organization. So it's like we just want the development of a free market with self-consensus. We want consensus, no governance. And that's what leads to world peace. That's what leads to a type 1 society. That's what leads to the elimination of poverty and the elimination of war and the elimination of all of these things that people in social movements claim to care about, but they don't actually really want solutions. They want compliance for the most part. And a lot of these people are well-intentioned. You know, like the kind of people I'm talking about, like, you know, the people that just want you to comply no matter what, put the mask over your nose. Those kind of people, they generally actually mean well, and they're sort of like within a group structure. Say those people lived in a tribal society. Those are the kind of people that keep the balance. Those are the people that are responsible for the consensus without governance, right? It's those people. Like if you look at all these people that comply, I mean, they're the reason why that you have to comply. It's not because of the government so much. It's because all the people around you are complying, right? And that's sort of how it works. In a stable society, you need those people because they should be maintaining good rules. Absolutely. The problem becomes when the rules get issued from a arbitrary decree point that are disconnected from the reality of the situation. And then you essentially have a bunch of mindless minions enforcing stupid rules. And that's when it leads to problems, right? But in a stable, healthy society, those people are really necessary. You need those people. But we don't realize that because of the way that everything's structured out. And, you know, it's got to go back. It has to go back to the way it is. I have a saying that Bitcoin takes the land back. Because even within the land back movement, there's so much controversy and political pandering. The left has sort of co-opted the movement the same way they've done with Antifa and all these other things.
They co-opt everything.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like wokest people under land back movement that really just want you to comply as well. And like abolish the state, nationalize everything. And it's like, bro, listen to what you're saying. Like, you know, the very communist ideology. But again, a lot of it isn't these people's fault. It's the fact that they've never really been laid out the first principles of things. And they're just told that the right is bad, so the left must be good. And it becomes this like, you know, we hate Stephen Harper because blah, 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 blah. But then it's like, really, but what's the NDP going to do for you? You know, they're going to get you to wear orange and say every child matters. But what else are they doing? Oh, they want to turn all the tribes into municipalities so that they're under the government's jurisdiction. Well, that's sort of a Trojan horse, right? There's all these like side ops that the government's always doing to attain more power and more control by, you know, divide and conquer. It's always it's the age old solution, right?
Sure.
For tyrants. And that's, yeah, man, we're in a powerful spot with Bitcoin. We're like I said, they're going to write history books about this time because by realigning value, you realign incentive and you restructure society, you essentially rug pull the state. And that's what's definitely going to happen. Look around. Russia just said a little while ago, right? They were like, oh, we'll take rubles, we'll take gold, or we'll take Bitcoin for our energy. That's it. Because that's the precedent. That's the precedent now. Value can't be issued. Value has to be discovered.
And you can see the further that we kind of dismantle the organization of the Cantillon effect of the powerful elite being close to the money printer, and every time that is threatened, they really react in just the most violent ways. It's kind of like when you see these people get exercised, and you know, not to say whether that's real or not real, but when you kind of hit the right nerves of that demon. Yeah. You know, they just say the right thing. Boy, do they really lash out in the most violent way.
Bitcoin's the holy water, bro.
Yeah, it's the holy water, right? It's the right words to say in the exorcism. But it's just kind of one tool that we have. regenerative agriculture and permaculture being one of the other tools to separate the state from its power.
Yeah. And I think they're the same. Like, this is kind of the whole base of my thesis, is that you should grow this from the start. Before Bitcoin, actually, before I ever went down even looked into Bitcoin in 2020, I'd, for the last 3 years before that, been just doing a thought experiment with myself. I have a friend who's an electrical engineer. And I had this thought. I was like, theoretically, I said, shouldn't you be able to grow a plant that outpaces its inputs and leads you to having a production of energy from a life cycle? And he was like, well, yeah, I mean, the math checks out. You should be able to. And for the longest time, I thought that was hemp. And it still could be.
Yeah, and a lot of people do.
Because Azolla produces nitrogen, right? It fixates nitrogen from the atmosphere and can effectively replace the Haber-Bosch method. And so that alone allows it to be food for whatever you want to grow. So if it makes more sense to grow hemp as energy.
So if you could just slow down for a second and explain to everybody the Haber-Bosch method of nitrogen and ammonium and kind of how that we collect nitrogen currently.
Yeah, so right now, basically, it's downstream from oil and gas. So they use natural gas generally for this process, and they're essentially fixating nitrogen from the atmosphere. So there's nitrogen that's active in our atmosphere, and they're pulling it down into a concentrated form that they can then utilize in agriculture. So that's what goes out to all the farms that they inject into the ground that causes the plants to grow. Most of it comes from the Haber-Bosch method. Some of it comes from other sources, but the most of the world's food is growing downstream of the oil and gas industry. So it's like literally when the oil and gas industry maximalists say that it's the reason for human flourishing, they're dead ass right. Like, it is literally the reason for human flourishing. You can't have human food production at this scale without oil and gas currently because the system is built around it. But this is where they're wrong, and they say that, that can never be replaced except by nuclear. That's all nuclear is the only thing that'll ever replace it. And I'd say they're wrong, because where biofuel is better than fossil fuels is biofuel. It's just concentrated.
It's just
so
old.
It's condensed. So it's more dense, meaning that you can move it. You can move it to different places, and it's going to take less energy to move it than you can utilize out of it. And that's why we have the world that we have today. And you can put a jug of gasoline in your engine and drive for a long time off of it. That's why that works. But biofuels, where it's better than fossil fuels, is you don't need a centralized supply. Everyone has biofuels. The largest crop in the world is lawn grass. Everyone has biofuel. It's everywhere. And that's what changes it. It decentralizes the supply. And I believe will outcompete fossil fuels because Bitcoin incentivizes it. Without Bitcoin, there's never an incentive to utilize biofuel, ever. Because the money printer works alongside of the oil field. They're combined together because they're both sources of value inside of the society. The central bank produces the measurement stick, and the oil produces the actual resource that everyone's competing for. Both are centralized. Yes, you can decentralize the distribution of oil and gas. It's not as centralized as, say, electric grid, but it's most certainly centralized supply. So the centralized supply of both the money and the oil, the petrodollar, you have the world we have today. Once you disconnect from the energy supply into a distributed energy supply and a distributed monetary supply, then society builds itself around those sources of value. And then everything sort of comes together afterwards. So right now, replacing the Haber-Bosch method is the most powerful thing we can do for agriculture. And so what Azolla does is the plant is an aquatic plant that floats on ponds. It grows natively to like the southeast, and it's the fastest growing biomass on the planet. And the reason for this is because it actually blooms in the same way algae blooms, because it has a symbiotic relationship with an algae that lives in its leaves. And this algae fixates nitrogen from the atmosphere and feeds it to the Azolla. So the Azolla is growing up to 95% of its biomass from thin air. So that means if you feed it a form of nitrogen in the water, which can be worm castings, food waste, manure, freaking put a pile of dirt in there. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It can grow in gray water, wastewater, whatever it is, and it's going to clean the water as it grows. It's going to suck all the heavy metals and the nutrients and everything out of the water. It's going to pack it into the plant. If you're growing it from a clean source, it makes a great animal feed. If you're not growing it from a clean source, you definitely don't want to feed that to animals. But what you can do is you can burn it and combust it through pyrolysis, create syngas as well as biochar, which is a stable form of carbon. and you're
Okay,
also
let me slow you down for a second.
Yeah,
Can
sorry.
you describe? That's all right. Can you describe pyrolysis for us?
Okay, so pyrolysis is it's low oxygen combustion. So what you're doing is it's a very high heat in a low oxygen environment. And what allows it to do is the volatile compounds get converted into syngas, and the non-volatile compounds get converted into biochar. And so you sort of can separate the molecules inside of whatever biomass you're throwing into it. And the syngas that is emitted contains all of the components, has different types of gases mixed in there, just like methane and other things. And that is combustible. So you can just vent that into an engine, the same way you do like a natural gas engine, something like that. It's just a combustion motor. You vent that into there with the proper setup and filtration, and you're off to the races. And so the biochar, as a result of the pyrolysis, then you can put back into the ground, and it helps remediate your soil. You can mix it with animal feed that helps remediate soil even further. Biochar in and of itself is a huge rabbit hole to go down, but there's a million purposes for biochar. It's a valuable resource, and it also is worth carbon credits. So under the ESG clown world narrative, they'll actually pay you to create biochar. Companies will just pay you for your biochar just to put it in the ground, because it allows them to claim green on their products because they're allocating funds towards the sequestration of carbon. It's a monetizable process even without Bitcoin.
Fighting the globalists with their own weapon.
Yeah, make it really expensive for them, right? They got to pay out a lot.
All right, so back to the pyrolysis method and how we're taking the azolla, the biomass from the azolla. Break it down to somebody at my level. I'm a farmer, okay? I'm not a farmer, but just say I'm a farmer. And I have a few head of cattle. I have some chickens. I'm kind of doing the permaculture, regenerative agriculture thing. I'm rotationally grazing my animals. I'm bringing in the chickens behind the cows and sheeps, and they're eating all the larvae that have been laid in that manure. And I have a couple acres of my property that I have a pond on.
Yeah.
I want to grow azolla in there. How do I harvest that azolla? Where do I put it? Do I have to dry it out? Do I have to heat it? Do I have to set it on fire? And what is the apparatus that I'm putting this in to produce the syngas? How much does this cost?
So those are some good points. The pond method would only work if your climate is appropriate. So if you live in an area that's gonna support the azolla growth, or it's probably already natively growing, it has to be very humid. It has to be warm. It's a tropical plant, so that's where it's growing. I think it's the farthest north it's growing is the Carolinas natively. So if you're to do that, you have to be in that environment, number one. I don't think that that's the optimal way to do things. That's what actually we're working on developing with our processes. We're trying to discover, and we're doing all this open source, by the way, so that once we have refined the process, anyone can utilize it and build it or modify it however they want. We want to make this as widely available and accepted as possible.
Sure. You don't want to be an attack vector.
I don't want to be an attack vector at all. And I believe that this can revolutionize farming, because it can bring that nitrogen input on site. And so what we're doing and we're experimenting with, and this is where I think the direction we're going to head towards, is we're going to be using hemp domes. So we're building hempcrete with hempcrete blocks. We're building like sort of semicircle domes.
How large do you intend that structure to be?
It depends on how much azolla you want to grow inside. It could be any size, really. Just depends on how much you're trying to put inside of it.
I'm just thinking, you probably would want an optimal size to say that, if you're in the northern climate like you are, you're going to have a heat loss on a really large dome. And, do you suggest this thing kind of be a 10 by 20,
We haven't built out enough to be able to say a number for sure. But it really could be as big or small, really, as you needed it to be. Depends on how many Bitcoin miners you're going to be using, how much azolla you're going to be growing, all these things, what your climate is in general. If you're going to do geothermal, if you're going to try to, dig down and have a geothermal vent inside of it, that will help out a lot. There's different things you can do to sort of keep it a certain temperature year round. That's the goal. It's Earthship technology. It's based on the same technology as Earthship. Okay. We're using hempcrete blocks instead of tires, because we don't want the tires venting off.
I've been talking to a guy named Hodl Rev, and he had interned for that Earthship project. So you guys should actually talk. You'd have a lot of information to share back and forth, and that would be a good collaboration.
Yeah, it's fantastic technology, man. Yeah, definitely put me in contact with anybody you think it would be able to contribute. But that essentially trying to create stable geothermal domes that don't require energy necessarily to maintain a stable temperature. And then what we're doing is we're going to utilize the Bitcoin miners through immersion mining to heat the water. So we'll just be heating all the water that the Zola is growing on to maintain a steady temperature. It likes like 80 degrees to grow in. So that way the water is the perfect temperature all the time for it. And that's what allows us to grow it super fast. Because if you have the perfect optimal conditions, the stuff produces its biomass, it doubles biomass 2 to 5 days. So it's just every 2 to 5 days you can harvest it, leave half of it, it grows back. We're planning on doing this through automated trays. So basically just like racks that lower into the water while it's growing, and then they lift up after the grow and harvest it just off the water like that. Like imagine like a strainer, essentially just strain them out of the water. And then you let them just air dry. And then we're going to pelletize them just through a regular pellet mill, the same way you pelletize grass or wood chips or anything like that. Just run it through a pellet mill. And then from the pellets, we're going to put it inside of a gasifier. The gasifier is going to run a genset, and then the gensets run the Bitcoin miners. The Bitcoin miners heat the water, which keeps the Azola. It's like a circle, right? Sure. As far as food goes, say you're a farmer, you got some chickens, you have some cows. What you can do is you can develop a sort of temporary feedlot where your Azola, you can put Azola for their food, right? So because again, Azola is growing so much of its biomass from the environment, it's going to exceed its inputs by 20 to 1. About. This is what the science says. Like all the papers, the scientific papers that measure all of this stuff. That's what this says. We haven't confirmed this yet because, like I said, we're still building this out. So we haven't played around with it yet to confirm these numbers. This is what the science says. On paper, this is what it should do. It's taking what you input it in for nitrogen, 20 to 1. So that means that you're going to have an exponential more biomass after than you're feeding it. So if you have a temporary feedlot area that you add a rotation essentially into so we're going to be doing this with buffalo, but you could do this with cows, you could do this with chickens, whatever. Rabbits works really well with this because there's papers out there, really good research on Azolas and rabbits, as well as Azola and ducks, because Azola and ducks, like duck, it's called duckweed sometimes, even though duckweed's a different species. But like they feed these animals essentially it's like you can give it a complete diet. Like a rabbit can thrive on like 90% Azola. You could supplement a bit of clover or something in with it, let it forage or let it graze in a field or something. Like you'd have semi free range rabbits that are mostly eating Azola, and then you can harvest all of their manure. And their manure is really great for feeding Azola. So you literally mix it in with water, and then the Azola is going to bloom from their manure, and it's going to feed the rabbit back. But you're going to get way more than it takes to feed the rabbit, right? So then you burn the rest, you combust the rest. Or you can do whatever you want. Now you have that nitrogen, you can compost it, you can add it back into whatever else you're growing on your farm. You can start growing hemp with it because hemp requires a lot of nitrogen inputs. Yeah. You can use that to grow your hemp. You can do whatever you want. It's sort of infinite possibilities, but we're hoping to build a circular system that's modularized with the Azola being pelletized and combusted. And then you use your excess for the animal feed that feeds the Azola, right? So that it's basically a temporary stage in their rotation so that you can collect their manure. That's basically it. So that you feed them Azola in this place while they're eating the Azola, you're collecting their manure. They rotate out, you're growing more Azola, you're combusting more Azola. You do the whole thing, you need more manure, you cycle them back in, you feed them Azola, you harvest their manure, you send it back out on pasture again. So that's kind of how we're sort of going to be building this, so that you basically bring them in, you harvest their manure, you feed them Azola for a bit, and then send it back out. So it's sort of built into the cycle.
Yeah, so you're just kind of adding another step to kind of like the regen ag rotational grazing kind of concept. With that additional step, let's bring in some of the animals, let's collect some of their dung and feed that to the Azola. So now I have a tank of Azola.
Yeah.
Okay, and I decide I want to take off a certain percentage of it, dry it out, pelletize it, put it in a gasifier. Can you explain the process of the gasifier for people? Because actually, you'd be surprised how many people don't know what a gasifier is.
So you can build a gasifier for cheap. You could go really cheap and build a gasifier.
Anthony Tatum was trying to have a whole closed gasifier system, and I think it was like $4,000 or $5,000.
I think he was saying, I don't know what he was saying for a number, but he has a pretty cool system he's trying to modularize and build. I've talked to Anthony a couple times. Might actually be in touch with him for some units for our operation. But the basis of pyrolysis, you can build this with like some steel drums and like a welder. Like there's actually a guy on YouTube who builds one without a welder. He builds a welder, like a weldless gasification unit. It's like a zombie apocalypse survival tool or whatever he builds just for YouTube views. But it works, and he runs a motor on it. And he built it out of like an old pressure cooker and some pipes and stuff. So like the basis of the concept is you have a combustion chamber with a draw on it, right? That's it pulls the air down through the fire. The fuel that you're adding to the fire gets combusted, but not all the way, because you're sucking oxygen out of it. It's a low oxygen environment. So that in that suction, you have all of your gas, and that gas is combustible. So you can basically plug that up to a generator, like literally just a little Honda generator. Once you have the gas being fed into the engine, you adjust your air to fuel ratio properly, and then the compression of the engine running will keep the flow of gas running through the fire in the combustion chamber, and you'll just keep running it as long as you have fuel being added, and then your biochar comes out as ash in the bottom.
That fuel in your system is the Azolla itself. Does the Azolla need any additional inputs to be combustible at that temperature?
No, man, you can literally throw in whatever you want. It's super high temps, but we're going to just pelletize it for the process of just ease of storage. Dry it, pelletize it. You can store pellets very easily. And then you can reutilize those pellets as animal feed. So they serve two purposes. So you basically have one system, and then you can feed the animals the pellets, or you can just put the pellets into the combustion chamber. You can just have like a hopper that stores the pellets, so it's always just feeding in. But you can do whatever with Azolla. You can turn it into petroleum. You can turn it into diesel. You can turn it into hydrogen. You can turn it into ethanol. You can turn it into methane. Like there's all these other forms of biofuel. Azolla is actually the best plant there's a whole paper on this, it being the universal feedstock for all biofuel. So producing Azolla en masse is a really good candidate for producing biofuels in general. But just what we're doing with simple pyrolysis allows it to stay somewhat low tech, and a farm to sort of build this all out without very much infrastructure or high tech equipment required. And then they have that system sort of running, right? And then they're just they want the Bitcoin miners to always stay running. So you always have heat, you're always mining Bitcoin, and then you're always producing nitrogen, whether you're taking that in the form of animal feed, or you're composting it, adding it into food for plants, or you're just directly combusting it. There's sort of all these paths you can take, because you have so much of it, because the under optimal conditions, it's just going to grow so much. And we see this as a way to utilize food waste, because food waste, this is actually probably how we're going to go about our fundraising to build this project, is by getting community engagement through food waste harvesting, because everyone is food waste, man. 30 to 40% of the food you buy, or a restaurant or a grocery store, anybody that deals with food, they buy it for their business. It's a lot more, but even individuals, everyone has a ton of food waste. And all of that food waste is food for Azolla. And you can get 20 to 1 as much biomass as you have in that food waste. So normally the cost to go collect food waste and bring it somewhere to turn it into methane through like digestion is not worth it. From an energy perspective, you're going to spend more energy than you're going to get out of it. But if you feed it to Azolla, you actually get way more out of it in the end. So that monetizes food waste as it's worth something now to whoever's collecting it. So you can actually pay people to pick up their food waste, which changes the whole parameters, right? Municipalities do it for free, but it sucks. It doesn't work very well. They create a terrible product that requires a lot of energy to produce. You wouldn't want to grow food in it because it's highly polluted with like glyphosate, things like that. And generally it's full of trash because people aren't motivated to give you clean food waste because it's free. They throw a lot of it in the garbage. So you're not actually even collecting near as much as you could. That's like a municipality's free, like, compost collection or whatever. But if you monetize it, meaning you're going around collecting it and then feeding it to Azolla, and then that had a conversion to Bitcoin on the end, you can actually pay these people for their food waste now. A small amount, but it's still worth something to them, more than zero. And you can create a market for the movement of it as well, to move the Azolla from the producer of the food waste, the food waste from the producer of the food waste to the Azolla place where it's going to get turned into Azolla and Bitcoin. That's a whole other market right there that anyone can sort of participate in if they're able to move it. So I see this as the potential to eventually sort of gather food waste, because there's so much of it being wasted. And whether you're a climate hysterical or not, it's still a wasted resource, and it should be utilized and could be utilized, and what better way to do it than to turn it into Bitcoin, right? I mean, that's the crazy part about Bitcoin is it's finding all this waste and it's making it worth it, right?
And I think that the power in that, the food waste thing, is the community outreach part of it. That people feel like they're a part of this system that has actual value, whether it's the Bitcoin system, whether it's the farming system, whether it's where their food comes from, how their electricity is generated. That's really the power in it. That they can do something as simple as collect their food waste and get it to you.
Yeah.
And they feel like they're doing something.
If you imagine if there was a program where you could like put a bucket on your porch or something and hit a button or send a message on a Telegram app or something, just send a Telegram message, hey, come collect my bucket. And every time they collected a full bucket, you got an amount of sats for it. I mean, I would do that just from a personal level. Why not? So I think that becomes like a way to, and not only would I do it, I would go out of my way to get as much as I could. And I'd make sure it didn't have like garbage in it. It would be clean food waste. And I think everyone else would have that same mentality about it. Like, why not just have a bucket gets collected and you get paid for it? That transforms so much wasted resources into a productive resource. Because until we transition our food supply chain to a localized, decentralized supply chain by effectively replacing the Haber-Bosch method, there's a route to getting there, and the route to getting there has endless amounts of food waste. Endless amounts. The amount that we waste in food is kind of ridiculous, but it's nonetheless the way that it works with our globalized system.
One of the things I appreciate most about what you're trying to do is right now, like you look at the Dutch farmers, and what are the Dutch farmers so upset about?
Nitrogen.
And it's the fact that it's nitrogen, and they're being limited in the amount of nitrogen that they can get from the system. In a way, so many of these farmers, especially, at least in the United States, that they depend on, I want to say this in a nice way, really without offend anybody, but farmer welfare.
Yep. Subsidies.
It's subsidies, it's farmer welfare, and if they can just decouple from that welfare system, and the same way can be said for a lot of downtrodden communities. If you can just decouple the native communities in Canada, if you could just decouple from that system, from that welfare system, and bring it back to the tribal level, bring it back to the community level, you can really achieve a lot of great things.
Well, I get a lot of pushback from the native community when I bring up Bitcoin, because they see it through the normies think Bitcoin is like the gambling on the baseball game being the baseball game, right? That's kind of how they see Bitcoin, and they don't understand the thing that it is, of course. And so they only hear the knee jerking about Bitcoin, right? Like, it uses energy and it's bad for the environment and blah, 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 blah. Capitalism's bad. Capitalism's bad. We don't need money. And it's all this like utopian ideal stuff, right? And like, it's like, yeah, that's great. But everybody here is talking on a cell phone. Everyone here participates. We're not going back to the Stone Age. As a land backer, I don't know any other land backers that are advocates for the Stone Age. We just want to go back to the benefits of the Stone Age.
Maximalist.
Yeah. We'd like the benefits of the Stone Age, but we'd like to keep our cell phones, and I believe we can have both. There's 100% a future where we have the best of both worlds. And so it's kind of like with Bitcoin, it's this weird touchy subject. So I prefer never to even bring up the word Bitcoin. I always try to talk about it from a first perspective. It's like, hey, let's harvest this value, let's produce a system where we're harvesting value within our community. And if you talk about it from like a food sovereignty perspective, they're like, oh yeah, this clicks. So it's like, okay, well, this is a part of that whole conversation. And it's like, oh, you need heat to grow food. You need energy to grow food. Oh, it's all downstream from energy in the first place. Oh, I see. So what if we do it all in house? Well, that's how you get to the position now where now you're like you said, decoupled, right? So I think for me, my challenge personally is being able to build the system so that it can be built for like $100,000, $200,000. Like I hope for a system to be able to be fully functional running, for that much money that's including miners and stuff. And I think the reason why that's important is to be able to get community support within these communities to build them, and also for farmers to be able to afford that on their liquidity balance. Like, okay, I can sell off a couple tractors or something to make this happen, because a lot of farmers are pinched for liquidity, right? So having something that's easy, more like a low barrier to entry prospectively for the industry will be important, I think. And then having as many people start to build these things as possible, because the incentive model will be there, and that's when it will really hit the communities that are the most challenged, that are maybe not receptive to it right now. That it breaks down those barriers, because they're like, oh, I see this is working. like that, there's massive incentive there. Why would we not do that? Why would we not enrich our community? Right? Because like a lot of people talk, oh, we want to not leave money. We want to leave money out of it. Like those same people are lobbying the government for massive funds to like enact social change. It's like, what are you talking about? You leave money out of it. You know, everything runs on money. So it's just a virtue signaling thing to say once you actually have the tangible monetary appeal. And it's like, yeah, we're producing real money here. I think that the industry will move towards that. And then that includes communities that are otherwise maybe not like, hey, let's put Bitcoin miners on this reserve. Maybe they're not looking at it that way, but then they will look at it that way once you can prove to them that, hey, this is going to solve all your problems, but it's also going to enrich your community. It's going to create resources within your community. So you're going to have valuable exportable products. Now you're not just a place where alcohol finds its way to it. Now you're a place that's exporting value, right? And I think that changing that lever, right? Like there's some kind of lever there. And then once you move it far enough, it's just going to lift.
I think that's kind of such a great lie that people share amongst themselves, is that money is the root of all evil, and it's not. It's greed. Money's just a medium of exchange. It's how we. It's how it's right. It's how we show each other that we appreciate the industry and labor and work and intelligence of our fellow human beings.
It's an amazing invention. Money is a beautiful thing. The ability for humans to quantify energy. It's amazing. It's the distortion of the money that's the problem. It's the love of the money. That's what the Bible says. The love of money is the root of all evil. It doesn't say money is the root of all evil. And I think that with the fiat system gone, you don't have a love of money. You can't love Bitcoin. I feel like it's impossible to love it in the way that you love money, because it is what it is. No amount of love for it is going to change your ability to alter it, right? But if you love money enough, you could probably make your way up to Jay Powell, right? Or whatever the guy's name is. Those are the guys that love money the most. They're the Nancy Pelosi's of the world. She loves money the most, and I think Bitcoin removes that incentive.
So I think a lot of funding for farmers is loans. You start back in the 1950s when all the salesmen came on the farms and they said, here, let me show you this amazing product and sprinkle it on the ground. And I'm going to come back three days later.
You got to throw in the Midwest, like, we're going to get you the best seed production you've ever heard of before in your life. Yeah. Unbeknownst to you, we've got the greatest technology. We're putting petrochemicals into the soil and you're going to have crops like never before.
Wow, I need to get me some of them petrochemicals. It's
progress,
really interesting,
Johnny.
because you kind of look at the snake oil salesmen of the 1920s, and then in the 50s, here they are. They're the fertilizer salesmen of the 1950s.
Yeah, 100%.
And so what did you do? You took the family farmer who was able to budget things and grow what he needed based on what his family needed and sold the excess. And you've turned them into a relationship with petrochemical companies, a relationship with banks.
They're downstream. They used to be upstream. Now they're downstream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How are they going to get 100, 200K for this? What are you thinking as far as the funding mechanism for farmers to buy into this?
Well, this is our challenge, right? Like I said, I'm partnering with a buffalo ranch to do this. We're going to use the land to build this out. And we're looking at that problem right now with funding, like especially if you look at regenerative farmers, they're going to be in a position where if they have liquidity, it's built. It took them 10 years to get there, 20 years to get there. It's a very low time preference market when you're doing regenerative agriculture because right now the cost of everything in the fiat food world is subsidized. It's diminished so that the producer doesn't feel it necessarily in the same way that they would when they go buy regeneratively raised beef. They have to pay for the actual cost of that product. When they buy corn raised beef, they're paying at the subsidized price for that beef. So for us to compete in the market with something like grass-fed, grass-finished bison, our market range is pretty small. Growing our market range is really hard. Very time consuming, more than cost consuming, but it's both. And so the ability to sort of like, hey, let's just take out 200 grand and build something like this is not there. And it's not there for most farmers. We know that. And so that is actually our current sort of what we're trying to figure out is where are we going to get the money to sort of leverage the system? And that's why we're looking at food waste. If we can sell everyone a bucket, and charge them a bit more on the bucket, then we can take that margin, we can, build the production system. There's ways of like approaching that we're looking at, but we're hoping to start a few crowdfunding campaigns as well, to sort of see if we can leverage support that way. But what we believe will be the real kicker is we're doing this first, right? But once we do it and it works and we prove that it works, I don't see funding as an option, a problem at all, because farmers have land, farmers have equipment. They have they might not have liquid funds, but they have a lot of assets. Every farmer has a lot of assets. So if it's proven that it does what it does, then, hey, let's sell 3 fields. Let's build this on one, and then we'll buy the other 3 fields back if this works.
Just sell them to Bill Gates. I heard he's in the market.
Exactly. Which, you know what he's in the market for? Biofuel. He's not growing food on that land. The goal is to grow biofuel on that land. That's where their quote unquote technology is. But because these people are deranged, they don't actually understand input and output. He's trying to grow biofuel downstream from a oil and gas supply. It's kind of retarded. But
just insert myself into this existing supply chain.
It's basically subsidized profitable. It's not producing more. It's consuming more energy than it's producing, but it's profitable because the government, the money printer, subsidizing it. And that's why he's buying all that farmland, is just for him a maneuver to get closer to the printer. That's all he's trying to do. Hopefully we can mitigate that by rug pulling the printer, by putting the value back actually in the farmers. Because like you said, in the 50s and all that stuff, they changed. The farmers before that were upstream of the banks. They were upstream of the energy supply. Now they're downstream from the banks and they're downstream from the energy supply. And that's why farmers are in the position they are in today. So flipping that back on its head, Bitcoin mining, that's what does it. Azola and Bitcoin mining, those two sort of combined. Whether you're growing Azola, pelletizing it, running it through your gasifier, or you're growing Azola, you're feeding it to your hemp, and you're running your hemp through your gasifier, or you're producing hemp oil, you're running a diesel motor off it, whatever you're doing, it's now possible with your nitrogen input that you're producing on site. In the Philippines, they do this. So in the Philippines, they don't have Haber-Bosch nitrogen. They're not importing nitrogen, but they have very productive, Filipinos are known for their food culture. And why do they have so much food and so much livestock and so much plenty? It's a very plentiful place. The Philippines are economically poor, but they're resource rich. And that's because of Azola. Everyone grows Azola as their main crop in the Philippines. That's if you go on YouTube and start looking at Azola, all the videos you'll find are Filipinos because that's what they do there. They don't have the other nitrogen sources. So I think that the funding challenge will be addressed once we can build the first one.
First domino falls there, then people can look and touch and see this is an actual workable model. And one thing you have an advantage of is you're going after farmers. It's like the beginning of the conversation. Why is the regenerative agriculture, permaculture community and the Bitcoin community so closely tied? Why do some people's entry into Bitcoin comes low time preference? It's that whole idea that we are willing to we're willing to earn something.
And this supports low time preference development of your, say your farm to table market. Your farm, you're trying to go farm to table and it's going to take you 10 years to build your market audience. Okay. Well, that it's going to cost X amount of money to get to 10 years from now where you've built your market supply. Well, instead of investing in some other resources, maybe you should build a Bitcoin mining operation and you should mine Bitcoin as a byproduct of your regenerative process so that you're funding yourself permissionlessly the whole way, right? Instead of having to bring your crop to market and hope the market's good and hope you have enough market, well, now your crop is sold on site to the Bitcoin network. And that changes your whole bottom line on a farm. So it would be a very powerful thing to put towards regenerative farmers as a base level of liquidity within their operation.
The biggest failure that I'm seeing on farms now is that the next generation doesn't want to farm. That they've seen maybe their father, it's not profitable. They know that they can just go work a fiat job and probably make a little bit more money than they on the farm. They've seen their parents suffer through 50, 60, 70 years of working on the farm. But there is that little inkling of hope. You get to see these younger people come back to the farm and maybe with a different attitude, Mom and Dad, you've been doing farming, maybe not in the best way. I have another way that I want to kind of do it. I've made some money out in the private sector and in the fiat world, and I want to come back and reinvest in the farm. And I kind of think that's the market that you have an opening to. I feel like you can almost go to a farmer's market and just find the young person there that is reselling their father's grass-fed beef and say, can I talk to you for a second about how your farm operates, and are you taking over the farm, and what's that going to be like?
These kids are native to the internet and they understand how these things work. And they go, yeah, Dad is kind of old school. This might work better. Yeah, that's interesting because it should be lucrative for young people. That's one of the goals. One of my team members on this, she's a PhD in soil science, and she's sort of passionate about bringing back the concepts of old in the way that we used to care for soil. And if we just utilize those concepts, farming could become so lucrative again. Like it should be. It should be like young people can't wait to get their own patch of land to start making mad coin. Like that's how it should be.
But it's the fiat system as to why people think food should cost X amount of dollars. It's kind of like Joel Salatin always says, like a $2 cheeseburger should not exist. In no way should you ever be able to get a cheeseburger for $2. That's a $5-6 food item. Is that everybody feels like they can go to the store and get a 99-cent this and a $1.06 that.
Well, the reason why is because the cost of living is so high. People need that cheap food, right, to compete.
Mm-hmm.
Like go to McDonald's at 11:30 at night and the lineups down around the block.
It's sick.
Yeah, it's because they're so strapped for time and cash. They're like, calories, and that's what it is.
Yeah, I don't care what the source of. I don't care the quality of the calories. Just give them to me.
Yeah, man, it's so sad. Like I just worked 3 Fiat jobs. I'm exhausted. I'm gonna drive the S-Class. I just put premium fuel in. I'm gonna drive it to McDonald's and I'm gonna sit there for 45 minutes in the drive-thru to eat my like disgusting $14 meal. Like, oh man, that's most people's life today.
Well, Moses, I wanted to try to keep this at an hour, and we're kind of a little bit over that. I feel like you and I could talk for about 2-3 hours and go down a million different rabbit holes. But I just want everybody to know what you're doing and why you're doing it and how we can kind of bring the Bitcoin culture, I won't say community, the Bitcoin subculture and the regenerative agriculture, permaculture subculture together, because they're natural kin. And you're certainly one of the people that are doing it and working harder to make that dream happen. I hope you're intensely successful. I hope all farmers become miners and Azolla growers and regen ag people, and let's feed people high quality food and give them a high quality medium of exchange.
Hell yeah, brother. I love that. That's a great way to round it up. Thanks very much for having me on, man. This has been a great conversation. I got some points articulated today better than I have in the past. So
Moses, somebody had to slow you down a little bit.
Yeah, dude. So I got ADHD real bad. So
not everybody knows what pyrolysis is. All right, brother. It's been a good talk.
Well, thanks, dude. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. I really hope you enjoyed that one. If you have any questions, do feel free to reach out and I will answer anything that I can. I really appreciate everyone who's been streaming sats, sharing this with friends and family, retweeting and contributing. If you haven't already seen all the work that we've been putting in for Pleb Minor Month, the best place to go is ungovernablemisfits.com. Mr. Crown has been working really hard to create a beautiful page dedicated to Pleb Minor Month. Check it out at ungovernablemisfits.com and we'll catch you on the next one.